Hey everyone, this is Pete, and welcome back to Atari A to Z Flashback, a series of explorations of the 150 games that make up Atari Flashback Classics for Nintendo Switch. Today's game is Sea Battle. This was a 1983 game from Mattel's M Network, which produced Atari 2600 ports of Intellivision games. While most M Network games got a new name in the porting process, in this case it kept the same title, though it was a considerably simplified game over the Intellivision original. This was primarily down to the fact that the Intellivision controller had a full numeric keypad to take advantage of, while the Atari 2600 only had a joystick with a single fire button. The Atari 2600's graphical capabilities were also quite a bit less than the Intellivision, so the overall look and feel of the game was rather simpler too. The game was actually never released back in 1983. Intellivision Productions produced a limited run of cartridges in the year 2000, but since then it's not been available anywhere other than in collections like Atari Flashback Classics. So, let's go play Sea Battle.
Okay, here we are once again with Atari Flashback Classics, and today's game is Sea Battle. This is a two-player only game, so in a moment I'm going to hand over to Future Pete, who will commentate on his Sea Battle against his wife, and indeed my wife. But first, as always, we'll take a look at the documentation. Now, this is a game that actually didn't come out back in the day, so the documentation we've got here is from the Retrotopia and Intellivision Productions re-release that they did in 2000. But they did quite a nice job of documentation of explaining how it works, aside from that slightly dodgy bit of text wrapping down at the bottom there. So, this is a strategy slash action game. On the Intellivision it was a little bit more strategic than the 2600 version is, but they made a fairly valiant effort with this one. As you'll see. So the game begins in map mode. The white harbour at the top of the screen belongs to the left controller. The yellow harbour at the bottom belongs to the right controller. Launch ships with the goal of entering and capturing the opponent's harbour. Engage enemy ships in battle to stop them from entering your harbour. So it's basically you're trying to get your forces from one side of the map to the other side of the map. And you can see on the picture of the map we've got there, the harbour is the sort of enclosed space in the middle. So the way this works, on the Intellivision you could press buttons on the keypad to launch different types of ships. Obviously on the 2600 that's not an option, because we've got a joystick with one button. So what you do is you push a direction on the joystick, like it indicates there, to choose what kind of boat or ship you want to launch, and then you press the fire button, and that launches a ship. Neither you nor your opponent can see which ship is which on the map screen, so there's an element of sort of secrecy about it, but it also means you have to remember what your ships are as well. And yeah, you basically go from there. So you move your ships around the map, you try and take your opponent's harbour, and if your ships come into contact with each other or get too close to one another, then that's when you go into battle mode and you fight each other. And we'll talk more about that when we're actually looking at the gameplay itself. And yeah, this is just further details on how it all works. Now this is interesting. This is about the history of this game. So we won't read all of that because it's quite long, but here we are. In 1980, Mattel Electronics released its Intellivision video game system to compete with the popular Atari 2600 console. Mattel prided itself on releasing video games that were more realistic and complex than the simple Atari arcade type games. We've come across this a fair few times. It was most commonly seen with the sports titles, as that was one of Mattel's first big gotchas over the 2600, if you like. If you remember when we look back at Home Run, Mattel used to use Home Run as a bit of a whipping boy to demonstrate how superior the Intellivision was. And yeah, the Intellivision had better hardware, aside from certain aspects of the controller, which your mileage may vary on. But it certainly had a more complex controller, which was more flexible. It could do more different things. And so yeah, there was this aim to position the Intellivision as sort of, I guess, a thinking man's games machine. A machine that sort of offered more mature games, more intelligent games, more cerebral games and that sort of thing. The Sea Battle was a good example of this. So, one of the early Intellivision hits was Z Battle, a strategy combat game. By 1981, it was the 5th biggest seller for Intellivision, behind only Major League Baseball, NFL Football, Space Battle, and Armor Battle. Yeah, so the M Network, which you've come across a few times in this collection before, was Mattel porting games from the Intellivision to the Atari 2600. With mixed results. Often they had to simplify these games quite a bit for the Atari 2600. And as we've seen in this one, they often had to simplify the controls and that sort of thing as well. And in fact, here we go. Despite appearing in Mattel Electronics catalogues and press releases, sometimes with the name High Seas, the completed game was never released. The reason seems to be that Mattel's marketing people learned something in 1982: simple arcade-type games sold better than realistic and complex ones. Yeah, so they thought that this game wouldn't sell, so they never released it. So there were lots of reasons for that. One, it was a strategy game which was assumed to be too niche interest for sort of the masses, as it were, despite the fact that the Intellivision sort of established itself on offering those more complex experiences. Marketing decided it would be a difficult game to sell. In tests, people found the game screen, mostly dots moving around a map, unexciting, and in a playtest where young teenage boys were given 10 minutes each on 8 new games, Z Battle scored lowest for must-have. Also, the fact that this was a 2-player only game as well. This was around the time that people were starting to realise that single-player games had a market and that they should really think about catering to the single-player. So yeah, by the mid-1990s, interest was growing in the classic video games. People wanted to play the games they grew up with. In 1999, Intellivision Productions, started by some of the original Mattel Electronics programmers, was invited to bring unreleased Intellivision, Atari 2600 and ColecoVision games to the Classic Gaming Expo in Las Vegas. After 17 years, Z Battle received its public debut. Visitors were able to play one of the prototypes on an actual Atari 2600 console. And those who took the time to learn the controls and strategy discovered that this was indeed a lost classic. Yeah, so at that expo, or shortly afterwards, I think it was the year 2000, they actually released this finally in a proper cartridge form for the Atari 2600, so you could buy a copy. I don't know if you still can. It strikes me as the sort of thing that was probably a very limited run at the time, and that was well, 21 years ago now, so you can probably find a copy out there, even if it's just a reproduction. But yeah, it does exist. It didn't come out back in the early 80s when it was originally supposed to, but it was eventually released in 2000. Anyway, that is, I think, everything to say about Z Battle without actually playing it. So I'm now going to hand over to Future Pete, who will take you through the game itself. So he will see you in just a moment. Okay, Future Pete here. Here we are with Z Battle. I'm just getting the game set up for me and my wife now. And I've already explained the basic controls and the rules of the game to her. And you can see we're already underway. I'm the pink ships coming down from the white harbour at the top. And she is the yellow ships coming up from the yellow harbour at the bottom. So this was our first game, which didn't last very long for reasons that you'll see in a moment. Initially, we both assumed that all you had to do was get to the landmass at the top and bottom of the screen, but it turns out that's not the case. This was our first battle sequence. So in battle, you have two main types of ship. There are ones that fire torpedoes and there are ones that fire salvos. The ones we got here are both ships that fire salvos. The way that salvos work are you hold down the fire button and then release it when it would be at the apex of its arc. So you have to imagine that the shot is going up in the air and then coming back down again as soon as you let go of the fire button. So the actual way that you hit something with those salvos is you have to hold down the fire button until it gets halfway between you and your target, and then release and make sure it lands on it. So it's very difficult to get used to. I kind of picked this up relatively quickly, but Andy struggled a little bit with that concept. It was a little bit strange. So the two stronger ships that you have access to in Z Battle both have that salvo option as kind of a handicap for the fact that they've got much stronger armour. And the two speedier ships that you've got, the two light ships, excuse me, they use torpedoes, which are just, as you would expect, you just fire and they hit things. So here I've got my, I think that's the battleship firing salvos, and then down there in the yellow, Andy has got, I think it's a submarine or something there, which is firing torpedoes. And each ship has a certain number of hit points, a certain number of points of damage it can take before it sinks. And it takes 1 point of damage from being hit by a salvo or a torpedo, but it also takes damage from hitting the land as well. So if you bump into the islands or the land masses, then your ships will take damage as well. So you have to watch out for that. So Andy's setting up a bit of a defensive position down the bottom there. She's covering most of the ways in towards her harbour. I'm trying to creep my various ships around. And then we've got another battle unfolding in the corner between our two PT boats, I think those are. Both of which fire torpedoes. But they only have 1 point of damage each, so you can see Andy ran into the landscape there and sank. So she's cycling around her ships by pressing the fire button there. And we have a climactic confrontation. PT boat against battleship or destroyer or whatever that is. I've really got my work cut out for me. But I do know that she doesn't really know how to fire those salvos properly, so there we go. Victory. Victory. A real David versus Goliath moment there. And the game is over with my victory. So that was our first game. We then thought we'd have another go because that didn't last very long. And we'd both sort of learned quite a bit in that first session. So we thought we'd have another go. And again, we both almost immediately picked up on the strategy of sort of blocking off the main entrances to your part of the map. The map is asymmetrical, but there's sort of roughly the same amount of ways to get from one place to another. So if you can create some sort of choke points where you can have a bit of a face-off with your enemy and hopefully kind of push the advantage a bit. So there I am, cycling through to my harbour and launching my fourth and final ship. You have, I think, 24 ships altogether, but you can only have 4 on screen at once. But that can be any mix of the 4 different types of ship that you've got. As you can see, they all just show up as dots on the screen, so you have to remember which one is which, or just take your chances. Bit of PT boat on PT boat action there. One hit and this is all over. And there goes mine. Mine is down. Had to respond quickly there because otherwise that would have been over before it was really begun there. So I bring in another PT boat and immediately sink by crashing into the landscape, but Andy does exactly the same thing. So we take each other out. So that was fun. One thing that we both kind of noticed as we were playing is that the ship controls are very sluggish. They're deliberately sluggish because, well, I mean, you're piloting ships around. So it does kind of give the impression that the controls aren't being very responsive, but it's actually just sort of trying to simulate the fact that you're swinging around a many-tonned warship. So you have to take into account things like momentum and inertia and that sort of thing, because when you let go of the joystick, you can probably see it in the way that they move. You don't stop immediately. You continue moving for a little while, so you can apply a bit of reverse thrust if you want to slow down a bit more quickly, but yeah, otherwise you have to sort of take that into account when trying not to crash into things. So it's not been going well for me so far, but let's see if we can turn it around a bit. Starting to score some reasonably reliable hits with those salvos now. I've got a better idea of how they work. Although that one just sailed straight over the top, as you can see. Nimbly avoid that torpedo. Too far with that salvo, and a bump into the landscape again. Much too far again, much too short, that one. But a solid hit finishes it off for me, allowing me to push the advantage just a little way and take a little bit more control of the map. But Andy's wasting no time in bringing a ship up on the west side of the map. Try and sneak one in there, but it's a tiny little PT bait, so all I've got to do is hit it once, and it's all over. And there it is. It is all over. Damage is persistent. Damage is persistent from battle to battle as well, so if one of your stronger ships takes a few hits, then that damage remains into subsequent battles, so you have to bear that in mind. That sort of farting noise you were hearing there, that was Andy trying to launch some ships that she either didn't have any left in that category, or if you push a diagonal direction on the joystick instead of one of the 4 cardinal directions to pick one of the ship types, it also makes that horrible noise as well, so you have to watch out for that. Bit of a torpedo battle going on here. Ended with a double KO. What a disaster. So as you can see, after just sort of one practice game though, this is already becoming a much more interesting match between the pair of us, because we've both got a better idea of how the controls work and of some of the strategies you might want to use along the way. It can sometimes feel a little bit like you're at a stalemate for a while, but the fact that the combat sequences are more sort of arcadey gives you the opportunity to sort of tip the balance one way or the other. In that sense, you can probably compare it to things like Archon and that sort of thing. This is obviously less sort of strictly board game style than something like Archon is, but the blend between the action combat and the more strategic gameplay is very similar to the sort of thing that Archon offered. And if you're playing this with someone who is reasonably like-minded and up for what this game has to offer, which is a bit of an ask, I won't deny, because I mean, it's not a pretty game. It's got a game with a bit of a learning curve as well. But if you can find someone like-minded who is up for playing this with you, this is actually a fair amount of fun. So there we are. I think we've both run out of a particular type of ship that we're trying to launch there. So I'm bringing the 4th ship. Andy is holding fire until she knows what I'm doing. So am I going to play defensively? Oh, no, I'm going straight for it. And she's coming around to meet me. Except I will probably sneak down those straights. There we go. Alright, so we're now either side of this island. I remember this. Yes, this was fun. We were both trying to outwit the other one around this island, and it just wasn't working. But yeah, eventually she just went sod it and went off to go and attack one of my other ships instead. But again, she was still struggling a little bit with those salvo controls. The trouble with them is the fact that there's not a lot of visual cues with them. Like, there's no sort of shadow underneath them or anything to show that it's actually flying up in the air. And that makes it a little bit tricky to visualize, because it just looks like you're firing a bullet, just like you are with the torpedo craft. And so that's one thing where a fair few people playing this for the first time will probably find themselves struggling a little bit. It's certainly the thing that Andy found most challenging about this. As you can see, I've pretty much nailed it by this point. So again, this is one of those games where it helps to have both people on the same page. If you're both new to this game, then great. If you've got one person who is new to the game and someone who is experienced in it, then you'll want to give the newcomer a bit of a handicap in their favour, because otherwise it'll end up being quite one-sided. But it's an interesting game. I enjoyed my time with this, and I thought the battles that we ended up having were quite interesting. It's a shame you can't run away from battle, as Andy is trying to do there, because that could have presented some interesting tactical opportunities. Once you get into combat like this, it is a battle to the death. I'm embarrassed to have been taken down by that by that terrible strategy there, but you know, sometimes you do the unexpected and it works. So Andy really getting short on ships now, hence the buzzer. I'm coming down for another assault and protecting my territory with those 3 ships up at the top. Again, I try and see if I can sneak through this middle bit here, but it's just too narrow to go. You can't actually get through there. But she decides not to pursue me, and instead to go and take on one of my defensive ships. And we have another salvo battle. We all know how this one's going to end, don't we? She is starting to land a few shots on me. But by this point she was getting a little bit frustrated with those controls in particular. It's understandable. I said there's just the slight lack of visual cues makes that side of things in this game just a little bit less accessible than it perhaps could be for new players. And there she sank herself by bumping into the peninsula. Victory looks like it might be almost assured for me at this point, but we shall see. Survived the submarine attack. Just this final ship left now. There's a destroyer I'm dealing with here. It goes down, and I am safely into the harbour. And there we go. That is it. That is Sea Battle for Atari 2600. As always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.
Today's game is Sea Battle. This was a 1983 game from Mattel. No, 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 no. No. That's the last one. Come on. I can't do it.